Welcome to another thing about Tartan, and tonight is dedicated to Scottish American Heritage Month. Every year the month of April is dedicated to highlighting Scottish heritage and remembering the Scottish Americans who've had a huge impact on US society. With an impressive list of contributions to American culture, Scottish Americans have a lot to celebrate. Hello.
Good morning.
I'm so pleased to welcome Mike McIntyre all the way from Raleigh in North Carolina to tell us his story. Mike's an attorney with Ward and Smith and was a member of Congress from 1997 until 2015. And with his own extensive Scottish heritage and links to the MacIntyre clan, Mike seemed like the ideal expert to tell us all about Scottish American Heritage Month. So, Mike, you were first elected to represent North Carolina's 7th Congressional District in the US House of Representatives in 1996, and you served there for 18 years from 1997 to 2015. So, as the political system's a little bit different in the US to Scotland, can you explain a bit more about that, what that means and what the role entails to our listeners?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me on your program. And it was exciting to have an opportunity to serve the people I had grown up with in southeastern North Carolina. Southeastern North Carolina is from Wilmington, where many of the Scottish immigrants first came to America. And that coastal city is on the southeastern coast of North Carolina. And then the district ran along the North Carolina-South Carolina line to the interior part of the state, to several rural counties as well. And it was opportunity to really, as I like to say, have a partnership with the people. Under our Declaration of Independence and under our Constitution, we have an opportunity to have 3 branches of government, of course, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And being in the legislative branch, we have an opportunity to pass the laws that affect the people not only across the country, but I always tried to look at the perspective of how are we helping the people back home in the area that I represented. And so it was an opportunity in the area that I had grown up in to be able to serve the people in a very practical way and to look at national issues and even international issues from a local perspective. And when you tie that in, like our interview today, from the Scottish perspective, it very much went from a local to an international perspective. Our congressional district, I found out after I went to Washington, actually has the highest number of Scottish immigrants in the United States. And I had grown up and been so used to hearing Scottish last names and background that you kind of think, oh, it's that way everywhere. But it really was unique and exciting to know that our congressional district, as well as our whole region of North Carolina, and really along the North Carolina-South Carolina border, had such a heavy Scottish influence. So that's why it was neat to be able to be involved in the Friends of Scotland Caucus that we started in Washington and the international relationship we developed with Scotland. And now that I want to say the law firm I'm with now in Raleigh, North Carolina is Ward and Smith. And we're excited to welcome the virtual trade mission trip that many of the businesses in Scotland, including yours, are going to be involved in the middle of the month of May, which of course now is just next month, a month away. And the National Scottish Business Council, I know, has been very involved in helping coordinate that trip. So it all ties together, from the personal experience and where I grew up to serving in Washington, D.C. in the United States Congress, to now having retired from Congress, but still being very active because I do work in government relations with our law firm, to continuing those kinds of relationships as we're doing even in this moment, and we'll be doing next month when your business and other businesses have a virtual trade mission trip to North Carolina.
Yeah, fantastic. So are there any particular highlights or experiences that you really enjoyed? What was special about being a congressman?
Well, the most special thing, of course, was being able to serve people back home that I had known and grown up with, and then meeting other people from throughout our congressional district. When we think about the opportunity to serve people throughout the area you grew up with, there's so many needs. And I had one of the most varied districts in North Carolina. We had some of the richest and some of the poorest folks in North Carolina. We had the hardworking folks that had worked in factories and on the farms. And then we had some folks who were CEOs and top executives of well-known companies who came and retired in our area because of the beautiful rivers and lakes and, of course, the beautiful coastline along the Atlantic Ocean. So we had quite a variety. Also, I grew up in the most ethnically diverse county of all 100 counties in North Carolina, Robinson County, where my hometown of Lumberton is. Actually, I was a minority in my home county. We had the largest American Indian population, the Lumbee tribe, east of the Mississippi River. So we had a strong representation of Native Americans through the Lumbee tribe. We had African Americans. Of course, we had those also from other ethnic backgrounds. And so it was an opportunity to represent people of all types of backgrounds who had all types of concerns. And that made it a very wide and varied experience. So in working to help the people back home, I had legislation that involved our farmers and our legislation that involved the Lumbee tribe and federal recognition that we fought for that tribe. I had opportunities to work to help our military bases and to help our veterans, those who had served our country, and also an opportunity to work on legislation that involved helping economic development and job opportunity, because we had a lot of folks who were transitioning from farming to work in the factories. And then, of course, with some of the international trade agreements that affected those opportunities as well. So those legislative opportunities were great. And of course, then the things like the National Tartan Day resolution that I was able to sponsor, and it unanimously passed the United States House of Representatives. It had previously passed the Senate, but had never been into the U.S. House. And so I was able to sponsor that and get that resolution through. And to hear the word unanimous is a rarity these days because there's so much political partisanship. But we were thrilled that Tartan Day, the National Tartan Day resolution passed. And we also got then President George W. Bush to sign a resolution, to sign a proclamation recognizing Tartan Day nationally as well. So we had support from the legislative and the executive branches for that. And throughout our time of being able to celebrate Tartan Day, we had special events every year in April on Capitol Hill, and usually the Speaker of the House, of the U.S. House, and the minority leader. So we had the leader of both the majority and minority parties come and celebrate with us. So that made it very special. It was a bipartisan event. And of course, we had folks from throughout not only the country because they were represented in Congress, but we had those private citizens who were involved in the St. Andrew Society and the National Tartan Day Committee on Capitol Hill and other organizations that support Scottish heritage be involved in that. But other highlights when I was in Congress or had an opportunity, some of the unique things that occurred were I had an opportunity to fly on Air Force One, which of course is the president's jet, not just once, which would have been miraculous enough, but I ended up having an opportunity to fly with each of the three presidents that I worked with during the course of my career. Which means I flew with the president from each of the parties, and they each invited me to fly with them twice. So that means I had an opportunity to fly on Air Force One 6 times. And to have those presidents come to North Carolina, or in particular to my congressional district, was very special because they were not campaign related flights. Usually people think, oh, well, he came to your district because he was campaigning. But no, they came to my district or to our state on issues like education, economic opportunity, support for our military. These were and also expanding broadband access in rural areas and bridging the digital divide. And those were some of the themes of those trips on Air Force One. So those were pretty unforgettable moments when you arrive in your home state or your home district. And I know when we first flew into Wilmington, when I was serving at the time President Clinton was in office, he was the first president since President Taft in 1909 to come to Wilmington, North Carolina. And that was quite a historic moment. And then from there, we helicoptered over to Whiteville, North Carolina, and the little town of Brunswick. And of course, that was quite an amazing sight in rural North Carolina to have a president come and talk about bridging the digital divide. This was in the year 2000. To stand in front of an old train station, which had been symbolic of bridging America from the East Coast to the West Coast back in the 1800s. And then we know the telephone helped bridge us in the 1900s. And now, with the internet and the opportunities we have in the 2000s. Symbolic, but also important practical events like that are things that you'll never forget the rest of your life. So those are some of the highlights. There are many, many more, but those are some of the special ones that I can share with you in the brief time we have today.
Yeah, wow. And to think, when you talk about Tartan Day, and then that's something we almost take for granted now, and that was pushed through during your time. So yeah, that's really
Yes,
interesting.
ma'am.
So in 1987, you were chosen as one of the state's 5 outstanding young North Carolinians of the year by the North Carolina JCs, and you've got a real strong reputation as being an advocate of family. So what drives this for you then? And do you think, is this part of, your Scottish roots? Is that all part of the same thing?
Well, that's that sense of family and wanting to always stand up for your family, stand up for your community, also be strong and involved in your church. I'm Presbyterian, and of course, the Presbyterian Church, emanated from Scotland, and the connections from the Church of Scotland and the Presbyterian Foundation there, and as we go back in history. And so, in fact, my ancestors that came to America helped found the very church that I grew up in Lumberton, North Carolina, First Presbyterian Church. And it turned out that one of my ancestors was one of the 3 original elders that founded that church and was clerk of the session at some point. And it turns out so was my father and so was I. So we had no idea until we started doing our family genealogy research that at the founding of our own church, that it was in our line of, I guess, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, if I've got enough greats in there. But anyway, that he was one of the founding elders of our church. And so having those strong family roots in your church and in your community, caring about your community, having that sense of reliance and working hard and being thrifty and being vigilant in what you believe and standing up for it. Those are just inculcated in who we are, not only as Scottish descendants, but here in America. It's part of the American dynamic that helped make our country strong, among other influences. But I know that in working with families, let me just say that influenced my eventually running for Congress. Caring about my own family and in the church I was involved in, caring about a community, which was a very rural community, and like I said, very ethnically diverse. And also that meant not only being active in our church, but volunteering in our schools. I've now spent about 40 years volunteering in our schools, working with young people, because I realize that our children and our youth are our next generation of leadership. And I started that as a young attorney when I was practicing law back home, and started a citizenship education committee to help people better understand our government, better see ways they could be involved and influence our government. And we know that many of the very first signers of the Declaration of Independence here in America, many of the first governors of our original 13 states, which had been the 13 original colonies, all had Scottish roots, and so have many of our presidents through the years. So that sense of community and civic responsibility is also another opportunity that you could say, is in our genes. And having an opportunity to be involved in making a difference in your community, I think, is part of that fabric of who we are personally and who we are as a society. And for me, it meant not only being involved in the church and being involved in our schools, but that also meant being involved in youth sports. I was a coach in youth sports for several years, and in Congress founded and became the first chairman of the Congressional Caucus on Youth Sports. And there's so many values learned from athletic and sports participation. And also being involved in economic development, being from the poorest of all 100 counties in North Carolina, as well as the most ethnically diverse. It meant trying to make a way for people to be able to make a living and have job opportunity and economic opportunity. And my being involved in the Chamber of Commerce led to my not only being involved in my community, but when I ran for Congress, people knew I cared about the community. I cared about their children. I was involved in the schools. I wanted to build a strong community on the faith and the values that had made a difference in the founding of our country and in the activities of our local community. And so when I had an opportunity to go to Congress, people knew that I did care about the community back home, and having been involved with issues that affect the family and affect children and affect our schools and affect our businesses goes forward even to today. And that's why I'm excited to host those of you that will be coming on the virtual trade mission in middle of May, because that ties right back into my concern about economic development and job opportunity and our opportunity to do better for our families and our communities and ultimately for our countries.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. We're in a very rural community where our HQ is down here in Duns. And yeah, the creation of job opportunity, that's definitely something that drove me to start the business. It's something very close to my heart, and I do like working with the local school. And
yes, ma'am. Well, you've done quite well. Your business has been very, very successful, and I think that y'all are to be commended for that, no doubt.
We're doing our best. So today, the state of North Carolina has got more citizens of Scottish ancestry than any other state or country, including Scotland. So can you tell us a bit about the story of how your family came to be in North Carolina?
Well, I was excited. It was when my two boys, who are now young lawyers, they're in their 30s, but when they were young boys growing up, and we were looking at our family history, we were talking to someone in our church who was the director of our choir, and they mentioned to us that their middle name actually came from McIntyre. And I said, oh, well, I wonder if we're, distantly kin. And they said, well, I think we are. And they told me about a lady who had a book about the Scottish Highlander Carmichaels of the Carolinas. That was the name of the book, written in the 1930s. And said that I think this lady still has copies of that book if you want to talk to her. And she lived down near the North Carolina, South Carolina line, below our hometown of Lumberton, near a small town called Roland. And right across the border in South Carolina, we went and met with her, my father and I, and she said, well, the graves of your ancestors are right across the state line in South Carolina. And so we asked her where, and she told us, and we found them. And there's an original church there, a Presbyterian church, where my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's brother had been a preacher, and he preached in Gaelic, or Gaelic as it's said now. And there's actually a historical marker that talks about how he preached to the original church congregation in his native tongue from Scotland. And lo and behold, that church had a graveyard full of Carmichaels and McIntyres. Well, my name, Mike, is a nickname from my middle name. My full name is Douglas Carmichael McIntyre II, named after my father. And we didn't have any idea that the name Carmichael went all the way back to our original ancestors. And it turns out that the Carmichaels had come over to the what became, was the United States, and had settled. They had landed in Wilmington, North Carolina. They came over on the good ship Jupiter, and they several other Scottish immigrants. They came from the Isle of Lismore, which is in the Inner Hebrides and is located right across from Oban, Scotland. And so we found out that the Carmichaels came, and they had settled just across the North Carolina-South Carolina line. And then they came with some of the McIntyres. Well, it turns out that my great-great-great-grandfather, Dugald McIntyre, married Christian Carmichael. And they had 4 sons, and unfortunately, Christian died in Scotland, but Dugald McIntyre came with his 4 adult sons, and they came with the Carmichaels over to America. And so he came with the next generation, and they landed at Georgetown, South Carolina, which is just below Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, if folks have heard of that. So I had ancestors who landed in Wilmington, North Carolina, and then the next generation in Georgetown, South Carolina. And so indeed, they settled along the North Carolina, South Carolina border. And the Carmichaels and McIntyres, to this day, you can go back, and the original grave actually says a native of Argyllshire, Scotland. And of course, that today is Argyll and Bute, Scotland, that area. And the Isle of Lismore, my wife and I went there on our 25th wedding anniversary a few years ago. And the original church where my ancestors were married is still there on the Isle of Lismore. It's amazing, and it's still an active church. And one of my sons found that on the internet, and so we mentioned that when the Scottish government had invited us to come over on a business trip, and just said while we're there, we would like to just go over to the Isle of Lismore. And so they arranged for us to be able to do that. And not only did we get to visit the folks at Lismore and visit the church, but the BBC found out that we were going to be there, and they sent a young lady with a camera, and we said, well, we would like to have a few private moments to step into the church, which she honored. But then she did a story about us going back to trace our roots. And to the credit of Scotland, the government had just established the Genealogical Center in Edinburgh, and they were collecting all the information about Scottish heritage and families and all the parishes in Scotland. And so they had a centralized record, and that helped us trace back who their ancestors were, Dougal McIntyre and Christian Carmichael there at Lismore. And so the folks couldn't have been more welcoming at Lismore. And it was real special for our family to go back and trace our roots. That night, to our surprise, at the hotel we were staying, some other of my congressional colleagues told us when the evening news came on, we were getting ready to go out to dinner. And they said, did you just see yourself on the news? And we said, no. They said, well, the BBC did a story at the end of the news that night talking about how folks now can find and trace their Scottish roots, and that a congressman from the United States had come back and traced his roots back, and they had a special story. So they told about going back to find our roots. So it's that kind of special connection that our family has had. And the next year I took my boys who were graduating from law school, I took them back to see their roots as well. And so our family is continuing to have that interest. We got the MacIntyre Tartan kilts for my sons. And of course, on Tartan Day this year, there are pictures that were posted on the internet of them wearing their kilts. And of course, the tie I have on is from the Friends of Scotland Caucus. I do have the MacIntyre Tartan tie, but this one I'm wearing today is the Friends of Scotland Caucus tie. And it was presented to us on one of our official trips to Scotland by the Scottish government. They had registered this tartan, which is a combination of the colors in the American flag, obviously also the colors in the Scottish saltire, and also the colors of the McIntyre and Duncan clans. And Congressman Jimmy Duncan from Tennessee, he and I were the co-founders and co-chairman originally of the Friends of Scotland Caucus. And so they put all those colors into this tie and designed it. And we were the only caucus in the United States Congress I know that had our own tartan, but also that you got a necktie or the women got a scarf that had this special emblem, this tartan on it. And so it's a very special recognition for the Friends of Scotland Caucus in the United States Congress.
Yeah. Wow, what a story. So tell us, just to explain to people what a caucus is, because I know that was something when I came back here and was telling our staff about chatting to you, and they were just like, what's a caucus? So can you explain to us Scots what a caucus is?
Yes, ma'am. In Congress, a caucus is a group of folks that have a common interest in a common concern or item. And we have caucuses on all types of topics. And so it didn't matter what party you were in or where you were from geographically or how long you had served in Congress. There was a cancer caucus for folks concerned about fighting cancer. There's a caucus to help to support each branch of our military. There's a caucus to support senior citizens. There are caucuses to support all kinds of different issues and different concerns. And so we started there's a caucus on Scotland, and we call it the Friends of Scotland Caucus. It was very, very active, and every other year the Scottish government would extend an official invitation for us as members of Congress to travel to Scotland. And in the other years, we would invite the First Minister or members of the Scottish Parliament to come to America. And in fact, one of those years we had a Robert Burns symposium at the Library of Congress here in Washington. And sure enough, Sean Connery himself, 007, James Bond, he came. So that was quite a hit, obviously. And we had the Red Hot Chili Pipers, who played the bagpipes. They brought the house down. I've never heard a band like that play in the Library of Congress, but we had a private meeting room, and they put on quite a wonderful show. And so it brought a great awareness to Capitol Hill, having that Robert Burns Symposium. So a caucus is a group that has a common interest, and that's as opposed to a standing committee. There are committees in Congress that deal with the business of Congress, obviously. I served on the Armed Services Committee, and I served on the Agriculture Committee. Those are official committees that are designated, but the caucus is based upon a common interest and can be formed by the congressmen themselves.
Interesting. Good that we're learning things as we go.
Yes, ma'am.
So we discovered a brilliant story about the categorization of books in the US Library of Congress. Can you tell us that story? Well,
it turns out that I was on a trip over to the UK on other business for Congress, and in fact was going to have some meetings involving the Armed Services Committee in London and then also up in Edinburgh. And we were going to go out to Faslane, which is where the nuclear submarine place is located in Scotland. And so as I arrived in London, I got a call that the First Minister of Scotland was trying to reach me. And so I stepped out, and when I had an opportunity to make the call from London to Edinburgh, and was told that there was a great concern about Scottish literature being put under the rubric of English literature. And I immediately knew what a great insult that would be with all the great works of art of the many Scottish. I mean, we talked about Robert Burns earlier, not to mention Sir Walter Scott, and the list goes on and on. We can name numerous wonderfully well-respected and well-known Scottish writers through the years. And so Alex Salmond, of course, was First Minister at the time this happened, and he had called me and asked what I could do to help. And so I called back to the United States, spoke to my congressional staff, was trying to locate John Billingsley, who was the librarian of the U.S. Library of Congress. And he wasn't in Washington, he was in New York City at the time. So then we had to get a connection with him in New York City. And I was in London, and then we were talking to the First Minister in Edinburgh, so in Scotland. So we had quite a connection of phone calls going on at the time. And that was on the evening after I arrived in London. And so then the next day, within a day, it turned out that we were following up with the folks in Scotland, and we were able to get the Library of Congress to agree that they would announce that indeed it would remain under the rubric of Scottish literature and not English literature. And there were quite a number of phone calls. There were quite a number of discussions that we had to make to make sure that we could protect the good name of Scotland and the good name of those in Scottish literature. And we were successful in that. We're grateful that the Library of Congress decided to put Scottish literature under the rubric of Scottish literature and not under English like they had discussed doing. And it's because of the pervasive influence, it turns out, that the Library of Congress has on libraries across the world, that I was told other libraries will follow their lead. Can you please do something? So we were thrilled that we were able to allow Scottish literature to survive. I went on about the armed services business that week. And when my wife and I were having breakfast on the last day we were in Scotland, we were getting ready to leave on a Sunday. And that morning we were at breakfast, and someone said, "Have you seen the Times?" And I said, "Well, no." And they said, "Well, you're on the front page of the Times." And so they showed me the newspaper. And of course, there in Edinburgh, there was a story about how Scottish literature survives, and it had been able to defeat the attempts by the English to overtake Scottish literature. You know, they made a nice, fun story out of it. And sure enough, the Washington Post picked up that story, and they wrote it in more detail. after I returned back to the United States. And then one of the premier newspapers in North Carolina, the News and Observer out of Raleigh, North Carolina, called me, and they went into quite a detailed story. And they had a lot of fun with the story, talking about those who have fought, for Scotland through the ages, and all the times that it had had to deal with overcoming domination, by its neighbor to the south. And so it was quite a wonderful story, and that got picked up by the Associated Press, it appears, or by other news outlets here in the United States. And the story was running quite across America. In fact, here you can see the headline from Houston, Texas. You talk about how this went across our country. Scotland gained freedom from England once more. About our efforts to help Scotland stand strong and to preserve Scottish literature. So it was a fun story, and it was a wonderful, true story of being able to preserve Scottish literature as Scottish literature and not in the future as English literature. We were grateful that our involvement with the Friends of Scotland Caucus and the relationships with the Scottish government, and our opportunity, obviously, in the United States Congress and working with the Library of Congress, all of that interconnected and paid off in a very positive way.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Scottish American Heritage Month is all about engaging with our and new culture. So for you then, what happens, what events? So you mentioned the Robert Burns Symposium, but what other things go on just to raise awareness of Scottish heritage?
The largest thing is something I mentioned a little while ago is during April, we would have a Tartan Day reception on Capitol Hill. And as I mentioned, usually we would try to get the Speaker of the House to come, which would be by definition the leader of the majority party. And then we try to get the minority party to come, and that actually happened. We had leaders of both parties come. And we would have a National Tartan Day Committee, which were local citizens in the Washington area who were involved in Scottish heritage groups like the St. Andrew's Society of Washington and folks from Northern Virginia. And it was quite a celebration. We usually had a bagpiper playing. We usually had special remarks about the importance of Scottish heritage and influence on American history. I believe it was 9 of the 13 original governors had Scottish ancestry of our 13 original states in the United States. We know that the Declaration of Independence was influenced in a great part by the principles set forth in the Declaration of Arbroath, which is why Tartan Day is on April 6th, to recognize that date in Scottish history. And so Tartan Day was always a very special event, and most of us wore our ties from the Friends of Scotland Caucus or our personal tartan ties that day, or scarves for the women. Also, other events here in North Carolina, there are several groups that have several towns that have Scottish societies and that celebrate Robert Burns suppers in late January, such as down in Wilmington that I mentioned earlier. There are Highland Games throughout North Carolina, the most famous of which are the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games. Grandfather Mountain is the highest point in the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina, and nationally in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And then, of course, Mount Mitchell is not far away at the highest point in the Appalachian chain of mountains. But at Grandfather Mountain, folks come from all over the country and some even internationally to celebrate our Scottish heritage. It's a great celebration the week after the 4th of July, which is the American Independence Day. We also have Scottish games in other places across North Carolina, near Charlotte, the Loch Norman Games. Down in Scotland County, we have so many Scottish immigrants that there is a Scotland County. It's the county next door to my home county of Robinson. And those games are in Laurinburg. Laurinburg is the sister city of Oban, Scotland, that I mentioned earlier. Yes. And Laurinburg hosts the Scotland County Highland Games in October. And A Taste of Scotland is in Franklin, North Carolina. There are a whole myriad of celebrations. And then in late November, early December, the St. Andrew's Society of North Carolina celebrates St. Andrew's Day. It has a special dinner and address to the haggis and all the things that go along with that celebration in Pinehurst, North Carolina, which is a golf capital. Many have heard of Pinehurst because of golf, and of course that in itself tells about Scotland. But Pinehurst, Southern Pines, and Aberdeen, which ought to sound familiar to folks back in Scotland, those three towns together in North Carolina have quite a great gathering for St. Andrew's Day in late November when the St. Andrew's Society has a celebration there. So those are some of the ways we continue to celebrate. In the North Carolina Museum of History here in Raleigh, we haven't had a Tartan Day celebration except for COVID-19 interrupting it. Otherwise, the last 3 years prior, we had Tartan Day celebrations right here in the state capitol. That's another reason we're excited about businesses like yours and other businesses that might come and consider locating in North Carolina. We think you'll find not only a wonderful heritage in history, but you'll find current events and current activities that welcome those who have Scottish roots. And we also have the British American Business Council that's very active here in the Triangle, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill area, as well as in Charlotte. There are chapters of the British American Business Council that support Scottish and other businesses from the UK. I meant to mention also in Congress, we had a UK caucus, and our Friends of Scotland caucus was so successful that I was asked to co-chair the UK caucus. And so the British ambassador, where the Office of Scottish Affairs is located in Washington, would invite us to his home and invite us to events. And when the Queen came a few years ago to visit the United States, she was at the British Embassy. I had on my McIntyre Tartan tie at the time. And of course, we couldn't go up to the Queen just to take a picture or to shake her hand like we do with other elected officials in the United States. They said, do not. She has to approach you. Don't just walk up to her. Well, there were hundreds of people on the lawn of the British Embassy in Washington. And I was grateful to have been invited. And one of my sons was able to join me. And so I almost didn't wear it. It was a hot summer day, but it's a wool tie, as you know. But my son said, go ahead and wear it, Dad. So I wore my dress McIntyre Tartan tie, which has a bold red color in it, in addition to blue and green. And we were standing there, and as the ambassador was walking the Queen along on the lawn of the British Embassy, she paused and he said, Congressman McIntyre is a friend of ours. And she stopped and looked, and she walked over to me and tapped my tie. And she said, I like your tie. And of course, when she walked away, we couldn't stop and pose for a picture. So when she walked away, everybody came over and said, what did she say? What did the Queen come over to say? And so I'm glad that I took the advice of my son to go ahead and wear our family tartan tie that day, and to have the Queen of England come over and or the Queen of the United Kingdom, I should say, come over and speak was quite a memorable moment. So so you never know, and having that Scottish influence and having that presence and being involved in the UK caucus was a great opportunity. And we also went there to support, of course, UK businesses here in America, including North Carolina.
Yeah. Well, you have so many good stories. So we're, of course, all about tartan. I thought I would wear a bit of McIntyre today for you. Do you have your own kilt then? Your boys obviously have kilts. Are you a kilt man, or do you have other things in McIntyre tartan?
I do have a kilt. I used to wear one of my son's kilts when we would go to events if both of my sons could not attend. But that was a special. When I was at the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games about 5 years ago, I was asked to come up and speak at a symposium the day before at Lenore Ryan College, which is not far from Grandfather Mountain. And we had a Scottish symposium there. And then when my wife and I and some other friends and my other son was with me at the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games, we had an opportunity to find a kilt that we were able to order, and they had a kilt made, and so now I have one. In addition to that, of course, the family tartan tie, and then other things. The First Minister at one point had talked to me, and of course, when I was in Scotland, made sure I got the Scottish cufflinks, and we have our family crest, and we have other things, but I have the full Scottish outfit, and have worn that, in fact, in my home church in Lumberton, First Presbyterian, when my wife and both of our sons and their wives, in fact, that was posted also on Facebook this past Tartan Day, of us wearing our entire Scottish regalia. And so hopefully, I think the Council of Scottish Clans and Chiefs of Scottish clans and associations is going to post those pictures on the internet as well. So you may be able to see some of those, or I'll have to send you a picture or two.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, very good. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Very much appreciate
Oh, yes,
it.
ma'am.
Sharing all your insights and stories. So I do wish you and your family a safe next few months, and most of all, I look forward to coming to visit you one of these days in North Carolina once we're allowed out.
Yes, ma'am. We'll look forward to having you. You'll be most welcome, and we're excited to welcome all the Scottish businesses to come, and hope that many of you all will locate here. We think you'll find it warm and inviting, and a strong atmosphere of support and success. And may God bless you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to join you today.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.